The last 6 episodes of Chinese revolutions have all focused on central and south-southwestern China. And that makes sense, since this area contains about 90% of China's population. But the revolutionary storm swept the entire country, and 2 areas in particular would play a leading role in the next episode. So I figured now would be a good time to give a brief overview of what was going on in China's outskirts in the early 20th century, looking at Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and the Northeast. Han Chinese settlers began migrating to the island of Taiwan in the 14th century. The island's indigenous population mostly either assimilated with the Chinese or were pushed into the mountainous interior. The ruling Ming dynasty didn't have direct control over the territory, and in the early 17th century it was settled by the Dutch, who named the island Formosa. After about 40 years, the Qing defeated the Dutch and retook Taiwan. For the next 200 years, the island would be integrated far more closely into the Chinese state, as a prefecture of Fujian province. In fact, China's first railroad was built in Taiwan in 1887. But all that changed in 1895. The Sino-Japanese War was ostensibly fought over control of Korea, but during the war, Japan launched an invasion of Taiwan, and in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, concluding the war, it was annexed. The inhabitants of the island tried to resist, forming an independent Republic of Formosa, but after 5 months it was defeated, and Japan occupied Taiwan. Taiwan was not governed by Japan's Meiji Constitution, but is ruled as a colonial police state. Chinese resistance groups continued fighting for 2 decades afterwards, and were brutally suppressed. But the governor didn't expect force to be enough. The government established a policy of kominka, or Japanization, hoping to end resistance through assimilation. This was encouraged through infrastructural development and improved health and sanitation, but it had only limited success. In 1944, 51% of the population spoke Japanese, but only 7% had adopted Japanese names. And even when military resistance was successfully squashed, political resistance continued. The Taiwan Cultural Association was formed to resist kominka and keep Taiwan Chinese until it could reunify with the mainland. The League for the Establishment of a Formosan Parliament saw reunification as too ambitious and merely fought for making Taiwan a federalized, democratic part of Japan. The first major organization to advocate for Taiwanese independence, rather than just a return to China, was the Taiwanese Communist Party, formed in 1928. Although 2 of its members would later claim that it was only a tactical goal, and that everybody fully intended to reunify with China after it was achieved. Believe what you will. Taiwan remained under Japanese control until the end of World War II, and was relatively isolated from mainland politics, so we won't be returning to it for quite a bit. In 1642, the 5th Dalai Lama unified Tibet with a Mongol army, establishing a new theocratic state. This wasn't the first time Tibet had been unified, just the time that lasted till today. Lamas, of which the Dalai Lama was just one, are religious leaders in Tibetan Buddhism. The 5th Dalai Lama was the first to achieve secular power as well as religious. Just 2 years later, the Ming dynasty was overthrown and the Qing came to power in China. And in 1654, the 5th Dalai Lama traveled to Beijing to meet with the emperor. There's a lot of nationalist back and forth over whether or not this constituted submission and Tibet becoming part of China. Either way, just 70 years later, the 7th Dalai Lama used a Qing army to return to power after a brief civil war, and that marked Tibet's official incorporation into the empire. And even after this, the Qing continued allowing the Dalai Lama's almost total autonomy. Tibet had its own government, language, and religion, and did not pay taxes. This was a stable arrangement for about 150 years. Then the British arrived. Tibet had a long border with British India, and in 1888 they fought their first border skirmish. Afterwards, British administrators were content with Chinese control of Tibet as a buffer state against Russia. But around the turn of the century, they grew concerned that the Dalai Lama might be secretly negotiating with the Tsar to achieve independence. The Viceroy of India, George Curzon, began petitioning Parliament to invade. In 1903, they finally found a good enough excuse. We now learn that Tibetan troops attacked Nepalese yaks on the frontier and carried many of them off. This is an overt act of hostility. A British army moved into Tibet. The Qing government, 2,000 miles away and still recovering from the Boxer Rebellion, was powerless to help. A Tibetan army was formed, but on meeting the enemy, they saw that they were hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched, so surrendered without a fight. But while the Tibetan troops were being disarmed, somebody's rifle went off. The British freaked out and opened fire with the Maxim guns. The army was massacred. The British marched into the capital, Lhasa, and a treaty was signed giving Britain trade rights and the ability to station troops on the Tibetan side of the border. But Tibet still officially remained part of the empire, and the result of the war actually encouraged the Qing to take a more direct hand in Tibet's future governments. A governor was appointed who initiated a policy of Sinicization. Monks were banned from government, people were required to take Chinese names, and they now had to pay taxes to the Qing. But the Qing were running out of time, and in 1911, when the dynasty collapsed, the new government didn't have the resources to maintain control. In 1913, the 13th Dalai Lama proclaimed Tibet's independence, and he turned to the British Empire for protection. Representatives from Britain, Tibet, and China met to negotiate this independence. In the end, the result of this meeting, the Simla Accord, established the borders between Tibet and India, but China refused to ratify it. And while there was nothing China could do about it at the time, it remains a contentious matter today. Xinjiang became part of China with the Qing conquest of the 18th century. A huge, sparsely populated area, its inhabitants were primarily Muslim and Turkic-speaking. During the 19th century, it had been the center of some of China's most devastating civil wars, as anti-Han nationalist movements erupted frequently. That's why it's interesting that in the 20th century, Xinjiang was the one minority-majority region of China never to shake off Han rule. Yang Zhengxin was a general residing in Xinjiang when the Xinhai Revolution broke out in 1911. Yang rallied the Qing forces and managed to defeat the Republicans of the province. But control in Xinjiang did nothing to help the dynasty, and when Puyi abdicated, Yang swore fealty to Yuan Shikai in return for being appointed governor. He continued this way for 2 decades, always declaring Xinjiang's allegiance to whichever group currently controlled the government, while being far enough away that he could get away with not sending any material help. Yang's stated plan was to maintain order in Xinjiang and wait for the day when the Central Plains have calmed down. Yang maintained his legitimacy through differentiating himself from traditional Han governors. He frequently referenced his time living in majority Muslim counties and forging deep ties with Muslim leaders. He was well read in Islamic scripture, and he enacted legal protections for minorities. Of course, he also maintained power through executing any dissidents. In 1928, when the Kuomintang took power in China, Yang wrote that he was very excited about national unification and acknowledged the new government. But one of his top deputies, Fan Yaonan, was a Kuomintang member, and Fan hoped that the Kuomintang would support him taking control. So Fan killed Yang Zhengxin and declared himself governor. Before the GMD could even respond, a bureaucrat, Jin Shuren, had Fan assassinated in revenge, and Jin became the new governor. Jin threw out Yang's policies of support for ethnic minorities. He redistributed land from Uyghurs to his Han friends, which led to resentment against all Han people. To make up for this growing discontent, he expanded the secret police and implemented a strict internal passport system. And then, in 1931, he tried to abolish the Khanate of Kumul, a semi-autonomous region within Xinjiang. In response, it organized the Hami Uprising. The civil war lasted 3 years and killed thousands. The bones of the dead lie heaped in piles. Steaming blood is everywhere plastered. The earth is scorched dry, and no matter where you look, your heart aches. Ma Zhongying. The eventual winner of this war was the communist officer Sheng Shitsai, who invaded at the head of a Soviet army. Under Sheng, Xinjiang remained officially part of the Republic of China, but was de facto an independent socialist state. While Mongolia first became part of China in 1271, when the Mongols conquered it, after the fall of the Yuan dynasty, Mongolia remained divided and separate for 300 years, when the Qing dynasty began annexing it piecemeal. You may be beginning to see a pattern here. Under Qing rule, The distinction between Inner and Outer Mongolia were defined administratively, with Outer Mongolia retaining much more autonomy. As the Qing state weakened in the 19th century, Russian influence in Outer Mongolia grew. After the fall of the Qing, Mongolia's leader, the Bogd Khan, wrote to Yuan Shikai that Mongolia had been subject to the Manchu, not the Chinese, and therefore the contract of submission had been rendered invalid. The Bogd Khan was the 8th Bogd Gegan, the third most important person in Tibetan Buddhism, after the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. So Mongolia also began to be established as a theocratic state. And like the British in Tibet, the Russian Empire forced China to recognize Mongolia's autonomy. But unlike the British, the Russian Empire collapsed just 4 years later. With the beginning of the Russian Civil War, Mongolia was threatened on every side. Some Mongolian aristocrats, fearing communism more than the Chinese and feeling marginalized by the monastic government, petitioned the Republic of China to seize direct control. Meanwhile, in China, Duan Qirui was looking for an easy victory, after the failure of the constitutional protection movement. So he sent a force under the command of Shu Shuzheng to occupy the country. By February 1920, it was under his control. Shu's condescending treatment of the Mongols led to resistance and the formation of the Communist Mongolian People's Party. Shu was recalled from Mongolia for reasons we'll be discussing in the next video, leaving a power vacuum. This was seized upon by a Russian White Army general from neighboring Siberia. Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg abandoned the Russian Civil War and led his troops to occupy Urga, the Mongolian capital. Ungern-Sternberg restored the Bogd Khan as his puppet and declared the revival of the 13th century Mongol Empire. But within a few months, he was defeated by the Red Army and the Mongolian People's Party. The Mongolian People's Republic was established, and the capital was renamed Ulaanbaatar, Red Hero, after the leader of the party, Damdin Sukbatar. You'll notice I'm not referring to the region here as Manchuria. That's, in fact, a very loaded term. The term Manchu was coined by the Qing in the 17th century to refer to people from the northeast. But it was never used to refer to the area itself in either the Manchu or Chinese language. Manchuria, or Monzhoguo, was first used by Japanese scholars, and spread from them to the west. Most importantly, the name was heavily promoted in the early 20th century to build support for the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, so it has imperialistic connotations in China today. The Chinese and Manchu term has always been the 3 northeastern provinces, or just the Northeast. So the Northeast became part of China with the Qing conquest in 1644. And for about 150 years it remained sparsely populated, as the Qing government moved south. But in 1898, the Qing ended the centuries-long ban on Han migration to the Northeast, and the population increased from 5 to 20 million. In 1897, Russia began building the Chinese Eastern Railway through the province, increasing Russia's influence. Then, after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the provinces were split, with Japan dominating the south and Russia the north. Zhang Zuolin was leader of a crew of bandits who in 1902 were hired by the government as militia. This wasn't an uncommon arrangement at the time. He rose through the ranks, and by the time of the Republic, Yuan Shikai promoted him to the governor of Fengtian province in return for supporting the imperial revival. During the national confusion after Yuan's death, Zhang took the opportunity to invade and conquer Jilin and Heilongjiang, making him supreme leader of the northeast. And after Duan Qirui took power, he recognized Zhang's conquests in return for his support. The group around Zhang, which came to be known as the Fengtian clique, was composed of local politicians, businessmen, officers, and even old comrades from his bandit gang. He had one of the largest armies in China and became very wealthy. Zhang Zuolin's support for Duan Qirui ended in 1919, when Duan sent Shu Shisheng to occupy Mongolia. Zhang had been hoping to take Mongolia for himself, so he started looking for ways to get rid of him, and entered into negotiations with Duan's other rivals, the Jili clique. And that's exactly where we'll be picking up next time, when we return to the politics of central China with the Anhui-Jili War. Like and subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching!
무엇이 한비 아득하든 길이 밤을 증거 아득하든 반지